This is the Federal Mobility Policy Update with Yonah Freemark from the Urban Institute, Beth Osborne from Transportation for America, Martha Roskowski from the Mobility and Access Collaborative, and Darryl Young from the Merck Family Fund. This week, we'll unpack the Inflation Reduction Act. What does it mean for transportation? Will it mean more money for electric vehicles? Will it mean more money for biking, walking, transit? And what about safety? All that and more on this week's edition of the Federal Mobility Policy Update. Welcome to a special edition of the Federal Mobility Policy Update. This week, there is so much to unpack. So much has been happening over the summer since we've last seen you. With us today to unpack all of it is Yonah Freemark from the Urban Institute. Hi, Yonah.
Hi.
Also with us is Beth Osborne from Transportation for America. Hi, Beth.
Hello.
And Martha Roskowski from the Mobility and Access Collaborative. Hi, Martha.
Hi, Al.
And I'm Darryl Young, now from the Merck Family Fund. Let's unpack by starting to look at what this Inflation Reduction Act looks like. Yonah, how does it relate to transportation? What does it do for transportation?
So, as a lot of you all know, I'm sure, this is a large climate bill. There are a lot of elements in here related to the climate as a whole, but there are some specific elements related to the transportation sector, which is obviously the area that we're very interested in. So, one of the big areas of interest is the continuation and expansion of an electric vehicle tax credit, which will give people at the point of sale up to $7,000 off the purchase price of a new electric car and up to, I believe, $4,000 off the purchase price of a used electric car. And the goal of the tax credit for an electric vehicle is essentially to make it more feasible for more customers to be able to actually buy one of these electric cars, which could be really good for the environment insofar as it will reduce the amount of point source emissions coming out of our vehicles on the streets every day. So that's the biggest, I think, transportation element in the legislation as currently proposed. But there are also some other big elements that we need to be talking about. So one of them is that there's a lot of money going into clean tech manufacturing. So that's going to be both for the creation of new manufacturing plants and for the renovation of existing plants in order to make it more feasible to build more of the climate-friendly vehicles that we want to see, but also other sort of technologies that are really important in terms of battery storage and things of that sort. We're also going to see $3 billion going to the U.S. Postal Service to help with the goal of electrifying at least 50% or more of the U.S. Postal Service fleet, which, by the way, is a big change over what the Postal Service was saying it was going to want to do just a few months ago when they were saying they only were going to electrify about 10% of the fleet. So they announced earlier, last week that they were going to electrify more of the fleet, and this bill would actually give them the money to make that more feasible. Then there is $3 billion going to communities to be able to invest in improved streetscapes and street fronts, really for walking and biking. I see this as the only element of the bill that's really about transportation infrastructure directly. Everything else in the bill is really about sort of incentivizing individuals or corporations to change what they're doing. This is really about allowing communities to benefit from changing streetscapes. And in that way, it's actually sort of similar to what we saw in some of the programs in the infrastructure law that passed last year. And then there is $1 billion for heavy-duty vehicles, which could include some manufacture of school and transit buses, though the details of that program really need to be worked out. So those are all the ground transportation elements. There's also a little aviation fuel element going on there, but that should give you a perspective on what's going on in transportation.
And I should point out that it's part of a much broader effort to address a lot of healthcare needs and other economic needs. So it is a wide-ranging bill that we're focused on the transportation and climate elements.
Right. So we want to caution everyone that when we're recording this, the measure is not passed yet. It remains to be seen if it passed. There is a great deal of hope, but hope does not necessarily mean a law. So as you're watching this, recognize we're still waiting to see what happens with the Congress's adoption of the measure. Talk to me a little bit about, I thought I saw some money for reconnecting communities or dealing with the economic or racial injustices that can happen from highway infrastructure. You want to talk a little bit about either one of you want to talk about that?
Well, that is the $3 billion that I mentioned before about creating new, additional money for those kind of investments. And what is exciting is that the legislation as currently written does specify that about $1 billion or 40% is supposed to go to historically underinvested communities to do this kind of work. The way I see it, this really plays into, as I said, the infrastructure laws, programs related to reconnecting communities, which can mean decking over highways, replacing highways with boulevards and things of that sort. And also some of the other programs that the DOT is funding through build grants, raise grants, the raise grants, the former build grants, which, can all be combined together to create some actually transformative changes for communities.
The thing I'm most excited about there is they put a heavy focus on dealing with the overbuilt, very fast, very dangerous arterial roadways that go all through communities across America. I'm not talking about the separated highways like interstates. I'm talking about those high-speed roadways that are put smack dab in the middle of communities, which is the very definition of danger. It's the reason we built the interstates is because at least in the 50s, we knew that only someone who didn't care about safety would build high-speed roadways straight through communities. And if we wanted them to be high-speed, we would separate them. And we just recently released our flagship report, Dangerous by Design, which shows that pedestrian fatalities are up another 4.7% over the last 5 years, that we have seen we're talking about 6,500 deaths from pedestrians in 2020, and the preliminary numbers are 7,200 in 2021, way worse. If you are a Black American walking, you are twice as likely to be struck and killed than a white American. And if you're a Native American, you're 3 times more likely. The reason it matters to this provision in the Infrastructure Reduction Act is 60% of those fatalities are happening on exactly these arterials, these non-separated arterials. And in urban areas, it's almost 70% of them. So if we focus like a laser just on those, we could turn our story in this country around in terms of the safety of our roadway system.
Can I jump in with a question here on that? So this new grant program, $3 billion is on top of, we already have the Reconnecting Communities discretionary program. There's the Safer Streets and Roads for All program, the RAISE grants. Is this new money likely to be another separate discretionary grant program, or could it get flowed into some of those existing, I think really well-intentioned, exciting efforts? Yeah.
I mean, it could. For example, if you look at the way USDOT handled the RAISE grants this time, they had 2 very similar pots.
Could you explain what the RAISE grants stand for, what they are for those people who are not?
Well, don't ask me what it stands for because I have no idea.
What is it designed for?
I can tell you it was like Yonah said, it used to be the BUILD program. Didn't know what that stood for. I did know it was previously called the TIGER program, which this.
Okay, so what's the money targeted at?
It's really any surface transportation program you can possibly imagine.
Okay.
It's the most flexible pot of funding at DOT, both in terms of what it can fund and who it can fund.
Okay.
So it is overwhelmingly popular, and it's aimed at projects that are hard to do without this level of flexibility.
I see. Okay.
So there's a portion that was authorized in the Infrastructure Act that was passed last fall, and there's a portion that was appropriated, and they don't have the same rules, partially because they messed up the drafting in the Infrastructure Act. And so they tried to fix some of it with the new money. So they put them into the same notice with talking about different pots with different criteria or different rules. That's a little confusing, but that was just about a tiny bit of change. This one has a significant amount. I think it might be hard to group with the existing programs, and it may just be better to have a separate pot. But that is certainly something they could look at. And if they did, I think they would connect it with the Reconnecting Communities program, which is only $1 billion over 5 years, which is such a pitiful amount. I really think it was almost set up to fail at such a small amount because there'll be so little meaningful things they can pass. So adding $3 billion on top of the one could help make that more of a positive case.
What's also true is that, if I'm a community with a big project that I want to put forward to get federal dollars for, I can ask for money from multiple programs. I don't have to just get it from one of these programs. So, I think it does increase requirements for, a project sponsor to some degree, but the DOT, to its credit, I think has standardized in a certain way that the things it's looking for in terms of equity, environmental sustainability, and things of that sort. So I would suspect that a lot of communities are going to apply for multiple programs for the same project.
Yeah, it does seem to come back to this underlying need for agencies and community groups to come together to define what they want to do and then figure out the pot of money that will fund it, which is better than trying to create a program, create something specifically to chase one pot of money.
I will also point out that this program has a certain amount that is set aside for struggling communities, and that comes with no match requirement. So that's a big
deal.
It's a big deal. I will say a lot of people get excited about it. A lot of no match programs are much harder to get the project off the ground because it turns out that localities that are not putting their own money in it don't put the staffing in it either. And that becomes a big, big problem. So it'll be interesting to see how this works.
So let's talk a little bit about how philanthropy can help. I know that with the addition of Maria Zimmerman, who's been on this show before, at USDOT to specifically work with community groups and try to resource them. And Beth, you and I and she were once talking about how USDOT could authorize the use of funds to pay for stipends, to pay for technical assistance. What does philanthropy need to do to help support communities, particularly marginalized communities, to help play a role in determining how those grant monies are distributed? Anyone want to speak to that? Oh, Martha.
I'll start just quickly. I've been doing work in Colorado, really looking at how we go from the availability of these federal funds and some lofty ideals with the federal money to how it actually plays out on the ground, how that money flows through. And so from a more local level, I think, funding for people to be organizing the agencies and the community groups and bringing everybody together to develop those visions is really important because the state DOTs have plans for highway widenings on the books for the next 30, 50 years. They can suck up every available dollar. What we don't have on the books, on the shelf, are these more innovative plans, these ideas that have been developed with frontline communities, with other community groups, with agencies. So funding that, capacity building outside of the agencies is important. I also think that local agencies are struggling to apply for the money and then use the money because federal money is still really complicated to use. And so more resources internally for staff to use the money. And I would say just getting back to basic advocacy, funding local, regional, state advocacy, because a lot of the formula dollars are just coming through. It's just supersizing the tips. It's just pushing more money into the traditional processes that advocates have been trying to change to get better outcomes, better criteria.
Yeah, Martha, I think that last point is really important. When you say supersize the tip, what you mean is dig into the projects that they dropped because they were a low priority when they ran out of money and sticking them in. These are often the projects that have been pushed back or fought against, so they were kind of thrown on the end of the plan. Well, with what happens when you put a whole lot of funding into the program is you lose your excuses for not funding those generally terrible projects. So you don't want that. We want those local advocates and leaders to be able to fight for things that are more doable, that are more impactful today. And they should be arguing for the big pot of money, which remember is $450 billion, not this $3 billion to do every great idea. But I think there's a ton that philanthropy, I mean, you mentioned grant writing and internal support. That is huge for these smaller communities, or communities that were small 10 years ago and grew a ton, and they're still a small government for a bigger community. To help design and scope of projects, do some analysis in the area to justify why it's important, to convene and pay for folks who don't have the local capacity to help convene folks. These are really important. And I also think there's a big federal advocacy effort that we need to initiate to force them to make this program, all these programs, easier to apply for, including, more, look, the way philanthropy has folks apply for grants is it's not always the easiest thing, but you don't have to go hire someone for $30,000 to write your grant application. It's not like there's no template to look at. USDOT can look at that. They also require a cost benefit analysis on a ton of these things, but the guidance they provide only monetizes safety and moving cars quickly benefits. None of the others that they claim are a priority, like equity and quality of life and public health. And we should be pushing them to get on it already. They're a year and a half in. They need to fix those things. They're choosing projects based on things they claim are not their priorities.
So for philanthropy, there is a thing called the Mobility Fund, which is now in round 3. We put an RFP out there, a request for proposals or letters of interest. We got 65 back. I think that's the most we've ever received. It's a clear sign that the fund will probably be oversubscribed. There's a need for philanthropy to invest in the kind of community power building, agency, or advocacy power building that's necessary and generically to be able to respond to all these multitude of things. So we would encourage you, if you're a funder, to look at the Mobility Fund. If you're a grassroots group, look at the Mobility Fund as well and ask your local funder to support that as well. Let's shift now and talk a little bit about the greenhouse gas rule that we've been waiting for. I don't want to forget that I keep calling it the Infrastructure Reduction Act. It's actually the Inflation Reduction Act. It's a very nice form of branding, but for us, for our needs, it really is a climate reduction, a climate GHG reduction act that's going to get us to 40% by 2030. Well, we need to get to 50. 40% is pretty close. Let me just shift for a second to, Martha.
Hey, can I just, before we leave the federal bill,
Sure.
Can we talk briefly about what's not in it? Like some things, close to my heart got dropped out along the way. Could we just really briefly do the sad part of this bill?
Should we have like a sad trombone? Okay. Yonah, do you want to talk about that, or?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the disappointing aspects of this proposal as it stands right now is that from a transportation perspective, it's really about reinforcing an auto-dependent lifestyle and auto-dependent country. We're spending billions of dollars on tax credits for electric cars, but we're giving nothing for people to invest, for example, in an electric bike. We are, providing a lot of support for manufacturing of clean vehicles, but we're not providing anybody assistance for transit operations, which wasn't included in the infrastructure law for major operators. I think that this sort of auto dependency that we're reinforcing is very disappointing, perhaps not surprising given what we saw in the infrastructure law, but still disappointing because it suggests that the way we're thinking about green transportation is really limited. We're really focused on just the electrifying the cars part of it, not the whole ecosystem of creating more livable places where people have options to walk, bike, and take transit to get around. And that's ultimately what we need to be aiming for. And that's what was missing in this bill.
Yeah, and I want to add to that just to say there are tax credits in this bill, but there is some question about how easy they will be to pull down. And so there are complications even in making the Inflation Reduction Act operational and to move money quickly and move tax benefits quickly. But beyond that, this is the folly of accepting defeat in an infrastructure bill on the promise that we'll get to your thing later, which is something that I think those that want to see change in transportation do with some regularity, particularly on Capitol Hill. And I have to lay this very much at the feet of Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, who said, well, I know we didn't get to all the things you want, but just look at the Build Back Better. We got to a lot of it there. That's not acceptable. If we're going to do a once in a generation infrastructure bill, you better have the thing you want in that. Once that's gone, if your stuff is stuck in any other bill, it's the stuff to give away in negotiations. And we should learn that by now. It's happened so many times since I started in this field. I don't know how many times we have to lose the same way before we learn that. So I wasn't terribly disappointed because I had written it off a long time ago, but we need to circle back to those leaders that made promises after we didn't get what we wanted in the infrastructure bill and hold them to account. The last thing I will say is implementing many of the programs in the infrastructure law, especially all this money that DOTs have come into and setting up refueling stations for EVs. That is easier said than done. These DOTs who we have complained about for years, not liking maintaining, but liking building, you can get away with that when it comes to a roadway for a lot longer than you can for a recharging station. A road can be not maintained or not have the potholes refilled for a few years. The moment we build some of these recharging stations, some will break. We need a real operational agency take on this, which unfortunately state DOTs are not designed to be. This is something Stephanie Pollock said when she was the Secretary of Transportation back in Massachusetts. To be good at the things we care about, the DOTs need to become more operational agencies, and that's going to require a major change in staffing and a major change in just structure and attitude. So it's not just a money problem. That's why just pouring money out there doesn't fix everything. And we need to make sure we're addressing that whole suite of issues.
Yeah, I worry about the siting of the charging, because there are a lot of decisions to be made in that space that's going to fundamentally change who is most served, who is best served by the charging infrastructure. And to Yonah's point, the elimination of subsidies for e-bikes just seems really short-sighted, that both for personal transportation, but also when you look at freight and our delivery network, that final mile piece is the part that is most ready to go. It's the part that we can shift the fastest to being completely electric, whether it's small electric vans and all that, the wide variety of e-bikes, small electric vehicles that are out there.
It's also inequitable because while there are plenty of people that might not be able to afford a $30,000 to $60,000 car, they might be able to afford, especially with some benefits, $800 to $2,000, electric bike.
Yeah.
I would say though that the one thing that brings me a little bit of optimism, I do think I agree with Beth's sort of political analysis. I think, to be fair, everyone on this call said this during the negotiations related to the infrastructure law. I don't think anybody here is surprised with this outcome from that perspective. But, the thing that is positive and the thing that I think, Beth has been working on for decades now is saying, locals and state governments, what are you going to do to fill the gap that the federal government is not going to be filling? And I think that remains the case today. So we have the infrastructure law, we have potentially this new law that will provide money for cars, a lot of money for cars. The question is, can we get states and local governments to help fill the gap? And that's where I look at some innovative programs coming out of places like Oakland, Denver, where e-bikes are actually being subsidized directly by local governments. And I think we can ask many more local governments around the country to be making similar commitments, because guess what? It turns out it's not that expensive to help people pay for an e-bike because they're not that expensive. So local governments can help out a lot.
And those programs are wildly popular.
Right. Just like mayors were committed to electrifying the bus fleets, they need to be committed to electrifying other forms of transportation as well. Let's shift to, speaking of states, and the need for states to totally change the way, state DOTs to totally change the way they do their business from building a service to providing a service. It's a fundamental shift that's going to happen. We'll see if the more progressive state DOTs are going to be able to make that shift. But now let's turn to the greenhouse gas rules in which states are going to be held accountable for the decisions they make. This is a rule that was adopted by the Biden administration. Why don't we go a little bit into that, Beth?
Sure. So on the last day that President Obama was in office, the US DOT finalized a rule that would require states and metropolitan planning organizations to measure how much greenhouse gas comes from their transportation sectors. Now, this was part of the setup of an entirely new performance management program under a bill that we call MAP 21, which was a regular transportation reauthorization bill passed in 2012. And that resulted in 3 different rulemakings, one on safety performance, one on infrastructure condition performance, and one was all the others, which was congestion and reliability and freight and emissions. And when the Trump administration came into power, they kept everything in place except for the greenhouse gas emissions measure within all of those rules. And they struck that from it and took it out. This was something we asked to be reinstated by the Biden administration as a day one action. Well, it didn't do it day one, but 18 months in, they've announced a proposed rule to require states and metropolitan planning organizations to measure greenhouse gas emissions for transportation and set targets. The differences are they have a very fast implementation process. I think they recognize we have to catch up, as opposed to the first time through that it was going to go with all deliberate speed. It requires declining targets. And it says that those targets should be set as part of the overall nationwide commitment to net zero emissions by 2050. This is, let me say what it is and what it is not. It is sunlight and accountability. It is telling us what the states and the metropolitan planning organizations plan to do for climate with our tax dollars. What it is not is authority for US DOT to overturn any local decisions or to force them to do well. So they can fail to meet these targets as much as they want to. So we have more to do across the board in performance management to reward those that do well and to penalize those who do not.
So some states like Colorado have started their journey along those lines to be able to limit the degree to which highway expansion results in increased GHG. Martha, you were part of the team that led that effort to try to get that secured within the state of Colorado. Will this provide additional backbone or additional assistance to Shoshana Lew and the Colorado Department of Transportation?
I think it will. I think Colorado's rule, the greenhouse gas rule that was passed last fall, is stronger than this federal guidance because it actually requires that we meet the targets going forward. But having it codified at a federal level and a requirement for reporting and measuring and targeting, I think is really important. And it's a way to propagate what happened in Colorado to other states, to accelerate that propagation. And so far in Colorado, it looks like this rule may actually make a difference, that as our biggest metropolitan planning organization is diving into the measurements of the GHG emissions from their next suite of projects in what we call the TIP, they're kind of worried about it. Their first model run shows it's not going to meet the targets. So now they're going back and figuring out what they might have to change, including one interesting wrinkle is they're going back to local governments to look at land use changes that the local governments have moved forward to see if they can take some credit for the GHG reductions that are going to be delivered by those changes, which in a way feels like it's a little bit of a sidestep, like, oh, we'll get some points over here. but actually having the MPOs really looking at what local governments are doing and trying to quantify it and measure it and figuring out how to encourage it is really valuable, because as most transportation geeks know, we're not going to fix transportation if we don't address land use.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Martha. And I appreciate you bringing up the Colorado example, because I think they are sort of the nation's leader on this front. I share many of the sort of positive and negative views about the greenhouse gas rule that Beth pointed to a minute ago. I'm particularly concerned because, as currently written, my interpretation is that the state DOTs and the MPOs don't really have to take into account land use if they don't want to, because, you know, the words land use, the words housing, zoning aren't even mentioned in the regulation as currently written. And, you know, to some degree that reflects the reality of too many MPOs around the country just not having any interest in thinking about things that go beyond the highway. But it does concern me because, as you pointed out, transportation and land use are the same. They affect one another, they produce one another, and without putting them into the same context, I'm worried we're only getting sort of half of the climate equation right. So I'm hopeful we can continue seeing forward momentum on this transportation land use link, and maybe even get the regulation updated as it goes through the rulemaking process to start to actually bring in some language on that.
I think that that's a really good point. And one of my fears is that all the targets will be based on electrification goals and no transportation infrastructure goals at all. However, I do think that there is a powerful effect of forcing people to actually measure what many of them claim to value. If they're not measuring it, they don't actually value it. You can't fix what you don't measure. And what we see in Colorado is first, having to measure it starts to point out a lot of problems with what they were telling people. Turns out their promises and the reality weren't totally in sync. Second, we've done such a bad job in transportation that they're going to be desperate to find positives under every single pillow, because we stink at this. So maybe due to our overwhelming failure for decades, they will be forced to do just what Colorado has done and say, where can we find reductions, especially as they realize that the electrification stuff will move slower than people hope. Everything always moves slower. So they need, use all the tools approach to this. And I don't know how we do that without measurement. I fully understand that measurement is not the whole game, which is why we really need to push for a lot greater change to our programs and the law. But I'll take what is on the table.
I think that's been the spirit of the last week. We were surprised that the Inflation Reduction Act actually passed. We were all ready to move on.
It passed, just been agreed to.
That it was agreed to. Thank you. We hope it passes. We hope when you watch this, it's passed. So that is good news. And on top of that, did you have any signal that the GHG rule was going to be coming out? Was that a surprise?
We kind of knew that it had been hovering in the interagency approval process, which includes the Office of Management and Budget and the White House, for some time. USDOT would never tell anybody that the White House and OMB were sitting on it. But having served in the administration, I can decode it. And I think that the White House really slow move. We're just incredibly slow in moving this along. And I have to say, just watching what's going on and again, decoding some of the things I'm hearing, I think that the White House is a big problem in the overall slow and overly cautious approach to change. And that's something we're going to have to really think about, is pushing the White House to listen to their experts at USDOT, who I believe want to move much faster than they're being permitted to.
Good to know. Martha, we always close this out. Unfortunately, we have to run. You want to close it out with our question of the show?
All right, this is a tough one. Highlight from your summer so far. Something fun you've done.
Who wants to go first?
I'm happy to go first.
Okay.
I have to say, so far we've had an amazing summer. One is both of my kids went to summer camp at the same time, and my husband and I got to be grown-ups by ourselves. That was pretty darn amazing. We got to watch what we wanted to watch on TV, and we didn't have to cook for anybody. That's gold. But even more important, we got to do a really special trip with my parents and my siblings and their kids, all of us together. And we went to Galway, Ireland, and it was just, it's one of those great memories that will, stay with us forever.
Yonah.
I had a wonderful trip actually in the Netherlands earlier this summer, which I know, Darryl, you also were there. But I had a great time biking around, which I'm sure many people have enjoyed as well. But it was my first time spending a lot of time in the Netherlands, and I especially enjoyed The Hague and Rotterdam, which were amazing cities to be in and just lovely places.
Great, Martha.
Whew. Well, I went on a very cool study tour with my friend Darryl Young and some funders and some equity experts in Amsterdam and London. That was great. One of my kids came over and we looked at colleges in the UK and the Netherlands. I sent another kid off to a Knowles course, backcountry rock climbing, like, go kid. But I just came back from a backcountry bike tour across the middle of Utah, from Bryan Head to Escalante, high elevation, this neat network of huts, long, like a lot of climbing, but I had an e-mountain bike, and I've been an e-mountain bike skeptic. I just used it on dirt roads and gravel roads, and it was fabulous. It was a fun thing.
So beyond that great trip that Martha mentioned with equity advocates as well as foundations, my summer has been spent living what looks like the last scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark. I have nothing but boxes everywhere throughout my house. I am in the process of moving to Boston, specifically Brookline, Massachusetts. So it's been a moving experience, to say the least. And we must be moving. We call that a transition. We must be moving on. I want to thank everyone for joining us. Yonah Freemark from the Urban Institute, thank you. Beth Osborne from Transportation for America, thank you. Martha Roskowski, my partner in crime from the Mobility and Access Collaborative, thank you. And we'll see you all next time. If you like this, tell others to subscribe. We'll probably be coming out with another update as things change. Thank you very much. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.